than any other portion in the Torah.
So Rabbi Schwartz, I've heard described as 72 laws and 74 laws. Is that, it probably doesn't matter, but I always thought that was curious that they're described both ways.
Well, there is a lot of sort of disagreement about how you count the mitzvot. And so not uncommonly, you'll find different counts in different parshayot. It's very common, actually. If someone lists out that, theoretically, how many mitzvot are in the Torah?
613.
613.
613. And if you list them out, you'll find different lists from one commentator than another commentator. It's very common.
Even in the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God. So doesn't ring exactly like a mitzvah.
No, absolutely, Merle. So that's another good example there. So one of the challenges is when you get a parsha like this, all these laws, and they seem to kind of be all over the map. Is there any kind of organizing theme? Is there any thread that you can kind of pull through the parsha to say, oh, that's why this was put in, and that's why that was? Because they're on the surface, maybe it doesn't seem like there's any connection, but under the surface, maybe there is, or at least in the mind of the author, was there some organizing principle that the author was using to put the material together? So let's leave that as an open question. And let's just look at chapter 22, go through the first maybe 11 verses there. Some brave volunteer want to read?
Okay.
Eileen, great, go ahead.
If a man?
Yep. Well, it's chapter 22, so I have it. If you see your
fellow's ox.
Yeah.
If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass. You shall do the same with his garment, and so shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. If you see your fellow's ass or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. You must help him raise it. A woman must not put on a man's apparel, nor shall a man wear woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord your God.
Okay, there's Merle's verse.
If along the road you chance upon a bird's nest, in any tree or on the ground, with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let the mother go, and take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you do not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. You shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed, else the crop from the seed you have sown, and the yield of the vineyard may not be used. You shall not plow with an ox and an ass together. You shall not wear cloth combining wool and linen. That's 11.
Yeah, do one more.
You shall make tassels on the four corners of the garment with which you cover yourself.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eileen. All right, just on the surface, any kind of connective tissue you see in there at all, or maybe not? If not, and we'll leave it and we'll come back to it. All right, so let's look at, Merle, were you going to say something?
Well, it seems that before this Parsha, or before the recent Parshiot, that there was a macro set of laws for the nation, and now we're getting down to micro, kind of nitty-gritty, how man's relationship within his community, within his household fares, and rules to make it as just as possible.
Okay. All right. I think there's something to that for sure. Gail?
Shabbat Shalom. I have a question in verse 3, the last words of it. You must not remain indifferent.
Mhm.
Seems to be a theme, sorry, that connects all these examples. And I don't see any commentary in Eitz Chaim. Lo tuchal lehit alem. What does lehit alem mean in Hebrew? Translated as indifferent.
Yeah, it's an interesting word. Anyone recognize the grammatical form there? It's one of the 7. It's in the heat pa'el form. Heat pa'el, right? So that's one of the 7 sort of standard verb conjugation forms. Heat pa'el. Heat pa'el is generally a self-reflexive verb form. So it's used when you're sort of describing yourself. You know, like if you say, for example, I prayed, it's self-reflexive, right? Hit palalti. That's how you would say that. Hit palalti. So here it's lahit alem, it's the hit pa'el form. And the root, one of the ways to translate the root is would mean to disappear. Something disappears. So lahit alem, the way I would translate it is, do not disappear from this.
Yeah.
Do not disappear from this. In other words, there's a tendency in certain situations for people to just sort of say, yeah, I'm just not gonna deal with it. I know there's something I probably should do here, but no one will ever know, and I'm just gonna just sort of disappear from it. I'm just gonna step out,
Yeah.
And the Torah, one of the things that's striking to me about the Torah over and over and over again is its insight into human psychology. And evidently their psychology was a lot like our psychology. And so the Torah is knowing, that when people find something that's not theirs and they look up, there's nobody up there. They look over here, there's nobody there. And they take it and put it in their pocket, Why would you not? And the Torah is saying, I know you're going to do that. You cannot do that. Cannot do that. David and then Richie.
Well, so searching for an answer to your question, it seems that a lot of the previous laws were between man and God, and these have to do between man and man or man and woman, really drawing a line, men, you're doing this, women, you do this, but how we treat each other. But using that, who put the Torah together, this seems to me whoever was putting the Torah together looked around and saw, this is how things were, and we don't want to do that. So let's change it and modify it slightly so that we're more human and more fair to people.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt. So, you're seeing that there is this sort of the underlying current here has to do with human dignity, human rights, human responsibility, and it largely is bein adam lechavero. We would say that the commandments are divided up into a couple of different types of categories. You have aseh velo taseh, so positive commandments and negative commandments. Positive commandments are things that you're supposed to do. Negative commandments, things that you're not supposed to do. Then you have bein adam lemakom, commandments between us and God. And then you have bein adam lechavero. There's another categorical split in the commandments. So commandments that we're responsible to in terms of our relationship with God, commandments that we have a responsibility to vis-a-vis our relationship with other people. And this is bein adam lechavero. These are people-related commandments, right? Good, David. Thank you. Richie? Yeah.
And also it's interesting that a lot of it is focused on animals, about when an animal falls or, the bird's nest. I have 2 questions. One is, this is where it says that if you shoo the mother away, then this is the reward is a long life. And so my question is, a long life is mentioned here and is also mentioned in the 10 Commandments. When you honor your mother and father, the reward, so to speak, is for a long life. Are there other instances where the reward is a long life?
The only 2. So actually, if you look in the commentary just below the line on chapter 22, verses 6 and 7, This is one of only 2 commandments in the Torah related to the idea of living a longer life. The other is the commandment to honor the parents. So it's just those 2. It's just those 2.
Good. And then the second question I have is about the vineyard. You're not supposed to have a second kind of seed.
Mhm.
So I always wonder about that because it's very common now. One example is that sometimes someone will be walking their dog and you'll say, what type of dog is that? And let's say they're a cockapoo, which is a cocker spaniel and a poodle. And I always wonder, is that sort of that the Torah is sort of saying, is that planting a second type of seed so that it's Jewishly, maybe that isn't as acceptable as one might think. Is that fair or is that not fair?
That's an interesting question. We're going to spend some time talking about that commandment actually in a second. You know, so I tell you what, hold on to that, Richie, and we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it.
Interesting.
David, yeah.
In verse 9, you shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed. In modern times, we constantly mix and match different seeds for better crop yields, for the vines to be better resistant to insects or rot. I don't know where we would be as a society if we didn't do these things to increase our food yields.
Yeah, so the Torah is uncomfortable with that to the extent that it says you should not do that, you know, and we'll come back to that same thing we'll come back to, but you know, they did rotate crops. So they would use a field for, you know, crop A, and then the next year use it for crop B. They did do that. We know that. They also maybe left fields fallow for periods of time. So they had that sense of agriculture. They had that sense of agriculture. To go back to Gail's question about the word lahit alem, it appears also in the next verse. Did you notice that, Gail? So if you look, so you saw it in verse 3. So it's also in verse 4. Lo tir'eh et chamor achicha o shoro noflim baderach. And then there it is. Vehit alamta mehem hakem takim imo. Okay. So lo tira, you should not see et chamor, the ass, achicha, of your fellow brother, really, or shoro, his ox, noflim, fallen baderach, along the way, vehit alamta, and then disappear yourself, mayhem, from them, hakim takim imo, you must help him raise them up. Okay. So these sort of responsibilities, and we all do this so often, you know, where you see someone, now this is someone, you know, you do not know. This is not your friend. This is not your neighbor. This is someone you've never seen before. Someone, you know, and you pass along and they're having trouble with something. You know, it's like, you know, a modern equivalent would be someone, you're driving down Reisterstown Road and you see someone, you have no idea who they are. They're on the side of the road. They have a flat tire. And what you do is you drive by. And what the Torah is telling you to do is stop your car, get out of the car, and ask if they need help.
Well,
Does that mean you're
Rabbi,
going to start doing it? Maybe not, but that's what the Torah is asking you to do. Yeah, Bob.
I have the Hertz edition, and it uses the word brother rather than fellow,
Yeah.
interestingly. And it all, you know, in the last paragraph, I think in verse 3, it says, thou shalt not hide thyself, or, you know.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. So do not. Yeah. Yeah. And brother, Bob, brother, because the Hebrew is ach, which literally translated means brother. Achicha, your brother. But it's being used, you know, sort of euphemistic. It means like your fellow human, you know, your fellow human. Although, you know, you can read into it and say, even that person that you don't know along the road, they're your brother. They're a human being. You know, you could read it like that too. I want to go keep Merle's verse 5 aside for a second. Okay. We're going to come back to that too. I want to go to the mitzvah that Richie asked about in terms of shooing the mother bird away, etc. So there is a Talmudic legend built around this verse, which is the legend of Elisha ben Abuya. Elisha ben Abuya, there's a note about him in the commentary below the line. So you can see it says, Talmud tells of a young boy whose father told him to climb a tree to fetch eggs and to be sure to chase away the mother bird while doing so. While obeying both commandments that promise long life, in other words, the boy was honoring his parent because his parent told him to do something, and he climbs up and he shoos the bird away like the Torah wants him to do. He falls and he dies. The event raises the issue of God's providence. That's kind of a weird word there, I think, and then that's a site, Bavli Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. Chulin is the tractate, 142a. That's the daf, the page. It led one of the sages, Elisha ben Abuya, to despair of God's goodness and even God's existence. And then you can see Akiva, Rabbi Akiva tries to kind of get out of the theological conundrum by saying, oh, no. This world, doesn't work out, but in the world to come, it works out. In the world to come, But personally, that's not a basket I like to put my eggs in. If you understand what I mean. But this is a theological problem, and it's interesting to me that the Talmud explores it so thoroughly. There are a wonderful series of stories, painful in some ways, actually, but wonderful series of stories about this character, Elisha ben Abuya, who was early in his life one of the great early Talmudic sages, and has statements recorded in the Talmud that we still study today. But later in his life became an apostate, and his apostasy is tied in part to his inability to solve this theological problem, which fundamentally is, why do bad things happen to good people? And particularly, yeah, I'll get to you in 1 second, and particularly when the Torah, and here we are in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is so often telling us, if you follow God's commandments, things will be good. If you don't, you will be punished. So here's an example in that Talmudic story of the boy following the commandments, okay, and he's punished, and particularly the commandments that promise long life, and that's exactly what he doesn't get. His life is cut short. Gail, yeah.
There's a wonderful novel, Rabbi, you've recommended it before, As a Driven Leaf.
Yeah.
Based on Elisha ben Abuya. I can't remember the author. Yeah, I was just looking on my shelf too. I can't find it, but
Steinberg.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Milton Steinberg.
Thanks, David.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm reading it now.
Are you reading it, David? Yeah, it's a great book. It is, a book that tells the story. It first of all, it describes the Talmudic world, the world that the Talmudic rabbis came from, and what Steinberg does is he draws from a lot of these Talmudic rabbis and the stories that the Talmud has about their lives, and then he constructs with his imagination, a sense of the flow of Elisha ben Abuya's life, Akiva's life, like that. It's if you're looking for something to read, I would highly recommend it. So this is a theological problem that probably everyone struggles with at one point or another, and there are different ways to kind of navigate it. From a classic sort of philosophical construct that a standard understanding of God is that God is all powerful, all knowing, and that God cares. Those are the three things, right? God is all powerful, we say, all knowing, in other words, knows everything that happens, and that God cares. So philosophically, when you have something like the Talmudic story, then one of those three things has to give. Either God is not all powerful, in other words, God could not prevent what was happening, or God is not all knowing, God just didn't know about it, or God didn't care, right? So that's a classic sort of philosophical deconstruction of that. It gets back to the idea of prayer also, to me, because this is this is a time of year when we're really get into praying a lot. We got the holidays coming up. We're in shul, and it's a lot of words in the matzah, et cetera, et cetera. I always think of, you've heard me tell this story before, of a young fellow who started showing up at services back the first year that the Ravens won the Super Bowl. What year was that? Anybody remember? It was 2002, maybe? Or anybody remember? Whatever. So when the first Ravens Super Bowl season, those of you who are football fans will remember that in the middle of the season, the Ravens had a really rough stretch. I think they went 4 games without scoring a touchdown, something like that. And like they lost 3 of the games. They had a great defense, but they lost like 3 of the games or 2 of the games. I don't remember. And they had a game, was the 4th game, in this run where they were not playing well, where it went down to the wire and the Ravens had a chance to kick a field goal to win the game with like 2 seconds left. And in fact, the kicker kicked the field goal and the Ravens won the game. And so Monday morning, this young guy shows up in Minyan, right? And I knew him. I went over to him. I said, hey, did you have a loss? I didn't. He said, no, Rabbi. What happened was last night I was watching the Ravens game. And when the field goal kicker was lining up to take the kick, I made a promise to God. And I said, if the kick goes through and the Ravens win the game, I will go to Minyan all week. Right? So sure enough, this is a true story. Sure enough, the Ravens win. The Ravens did not lose a game after that. They won the rest of their games, all the games in the playoffs, and won the Super Bowl. So he started coming to Minyan every day, because every Sunday he would say, God, if the Ravens win, I'll go to Minyan this week. And then when the Ravens got to the Super Bowl, he said, God, if the Ravens win the Super Bowl, I'll go to Minyan for 3 months. And he did. He did. And then he never came back after that. He never came back.
But now we know why the Ravens did so well. Huh?
Right. But that's this idea that we have that we pray to God and God hears what we say. And if we're asking for something, then maybe we owe God something, we make a promise. Like that was his understanding of prayer. But I think a more traditional understanding of prayer is that prayer does not change God's mind. Prayer does not bend God's will. Prayer reminds us of the idea of God, and then that should inspire us to live in a certain way. And maybe the way it should inspire us to live is in part reflected in the material in the Parsha. Back to David's point from earlier, that there's a sense of trying to raise yourself up to live in a more moral construct, right? And the Torah certainly is concerned about that.
Rabbi, nonetheless, I think you should give Harbour the name and telephone number of this man who came.
Well, Bob, it is conclusively proven that God does not care about the NFL. No, it is conclusively proven. How do we know that? Seriously.
Because we lose.
No, because where the most Jews in the country live.
Oh,
In the East Coast.
In New York.
New
In New
York.
York City. In New York City. And by the way, the Orthodox community in New York, which is by far the largest Orthodox community in the country, one of the largest Orthodox communities in the entire world, a lot of the people in that community are sports fans. That means there are far more Jews praying for the Giants and Jets to win than any other football team. By far, it's not even close. And the Giants and Jets rarely win. I mean, look at the Jets. The Jets are, so that conclusively proves.
Rabbi, there's an old Burt Reynolds film exactly to this point. He keeps making deals with God. And when he gets an inch, he makes another deal. But it's an interesting philosophical film.
What's the name of it? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I'll Google it. Burt
Reynolds?
Yeah.
Burt Reynolds?
Mm-hmm.
Burt Reynolds. Wow.
Yep.
Smokey and the Bandit.
Yep.
Okay, let's go to the mitzvah in verse 5. And the mitzvah in verses 9, 10, and 11. Okay. Those to me are all connected. So verse 5 is where you have the idea of a person should not cross-dress. Man not wear women's clothing, women not wear man's clothing. Excuse me. Although one has to wonder, the way in our minds we think of people dressing in biblical times, they just kind of had these robes like sacks on, so what was the difference? I don't know. But so anyway, don't wear clothing of someone of the opposite sex. Okay. And then in, what is it? I can't see. Verse 9 is what David was talking about before, not sowing the vineyard with the second kind of seed. Okay. Verse 10 is not putting an ox and an ass together, two different types of animals to do the work, pulling the plow. And then verse 11, you should not wear cloth combining wool and linen. By the way, if you look in the Hebrew of that verse 11, lo tilbash, lavash is the root for to wear something. Lo tilbash, what's the next word?
Shatnez.
Shatnez. Yeah, right. People talk about it all the time. Orthodox community. You go, there are tailors, and you go and have your suit checked for shatnez. I mean, that's what they call it, shatnez, meaning a combination of wool and linen, and the tailors will take out, in a lot of wool suits, there's like a linen lining of the collar, sometimes linen lining in the pockets, and they take it out. They take it out of the suit. Okay, so what's the obvious connection between all of these things? No cross-dressing, don't put different kinds of seeds. Yeah, Merle, go ahead.
God wants things to stay in their natural state. Years ago, during one of the Parsha classes, you were talking about kashrut, and you were saying it's not about cleanliness, it's not about this, but everything, each species should be exists in its natural state and not be tweaked.
So yes, and building on that, and in its state, stay in its own category. Stay in its own category, right? If you go back to, let's take a quick look at the Genesis 1. Go all the way back in this Chumash, it's on page 3. For whatever reason, I don't know, but I think maybe. So go all the way back to page 3 here. Yep. And let's just look at verse 4. Vayar Elohim et haor ki tov. So God saw the light and it was good. Vayavdel Elohim bein haor ubein hachoshach. What's that? Anyone recognize that word?
To separate.
To separate. Look in verse 7. Vaya'as Elohim et harakia vayavdel bein hamayim asher mitachal harakia ubein hamayim asher. Okay, there it is again. Look over in verse 14. Vayomer Elohim yihi me'orot berakia shemayim lehavdil. There it is again. Bein hayom, so to separate, to make distinct. Right? You can go through the creation story, and that root is repeated over and over and over again. And clearly, what God likes is to have things in distinct categories. This is this, it goes here. This is water, water goes here. This is land, land goes here. This is sky, sky goes up here, right? And what God does not like is when things are mixed up. So God does not like two different types of seed in a single field. God does not like wool and linen together in the same garment. God does not like, and I'm not saying I believe this is true, but I'm saying this is the Torah. God does not like it when men dress in women's clothing. That's mixed up. That's mixed up. And it does play into kashrut, like Merle was saying before, because God does not like it. For example, what does a fish need to be kosher? Fins and scales. That's a fish. What if it has fins but no scales? What's that? That's weird. What if it's a crab? And sometimes it's on the water, and sometimes it's underneath the water, and sometimes it crawls on land. That's weird. It's not in a distinct category. So don't eat it, And that's a central concern in the Torah, and that's a priestly concern.
Rabbi,
that's one of the concerns of the priest authors. Yeah, Richie.
This would seem to apply then to the cockapoo. the material.
Yes, right. So my question about that is, is things happening in a natural way, right? So by definition, when two dogs create another dog, or frankly, when two humans create another human, there's a mixing there. It's inevitable, and the Torah doesn't ever mention anything like that. It's maybe because like that's just natural. That's what happens. Now, what you could say is that, well, but they're intentionally breeding it that way. And maybe the Torah would not be thrilled about that, although the Torah also would not have been familiar with very distinct breeds of dogs the way we are today, right? It's a much more recent thing to distinctly have these dogs that are so, categorized this way, that way. That's very modern, actually, very recent. Very recent. But interesting question, Richie. Yeah, Merle.
Thank you, Rabbi. I read something in Eitz Chaim that I don't remember having read before about the mixing of the wool and the linen. And according to Eitz Chaim, in fact, the priestly garments did mix the wool and linen. So one caveat for the lay people not mixing wool and linen is so that they don't take on themselves any aura of thinking that they're priests.
Yes. Okay. So that would make sense.
That was interesting.
Right? That would make sense. The exception to the shotness rule is what? Anybody happen to know? There's one exception to the shotness rule. It's the talus. The talus. Yeah, so the talus the material of the cloth of the talus can be different than the tzitzit. Okay. In fact, most of the taluses here, it's different material. The in-house taluses at Bethel, it's some kind of polyester, the talus. The tzitzit are made from wool, right? Now, why is that permissible? Well, one of the reasons is the juxtaposition of verse 11 and 12 here, right? So 11 is the one that says you shouldn't have shotness. Don't mix wool and linen. But then 12 says, Gidilim ta'aselach al arba kanfot kisutcha asher techaseba. So Gidilim, tassels, it's talking about tzitzit. So when you have Rabbi Zaslow talked about this a little bit Friday morning. When you have a four-cornered garment, you're supposed to put tzitzit on it. Over time, as the law develops, they say you can put tzitzit on a four-cornered garment, even if the tzitzit are different fabric, made from a different fabric than the garment itself. And why is that? Because you have then a conflict between two types of mitzvot, to go back to the mitzvah categories. On the one hand, you have a negative mitzvah, something you're not supposed to do. Do not mix wool and linen. That's lo ta'aseh. Don't do it. Lo ta'aseh. On the other hand, you have a positive commandment. Put fringes on the corner of your garments. Aseh. It even says that in Hebrew. Gidilim ta'aselach. Right? Aseh. That's an aseh. Positive commandment. You must do that. And in halakha, Jewish law, when you have a negative commandment that comes into conflict with a positive commandment, the positive commandment wins out. And it happens with some frequency, but the positive commandment wins out. In and of itself, that's kind of an interesting value statement. David, yeah.
So the cloth that many Orthodox wear underneath their shirt with their tzitzit, that would be linen with the wool.
Correct. So those usually they're made of cotton or linen, linen, cotton, and then the tzitzit are made of wool. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I can see where this is really confusing to non-Jews and people who aren't familiar with studying the Torah. It's like how you have one that's really clear that says you shouldn't do it. And then they look at Jews that do these things and say, how do you explain that? This is pretty confusing directions.
Well, yeah, it is, but the system has figured out a way to kind of adjudicate these things. It gets back to me. Some of you will remember back in the day, 30 years ago or so, the motto, anyone remember what was the motto of Bethel 30 years ago?
A
Judy, you
living
remember
faith works and a working faith lives.
Very good, Judy. So say it one more time.
A living faith works and a working faith lives.
A living faith works and a working faith lives. One of the things that I think was wonderful about that motto was that it really reflects the way Judaism tries to approach day-to-day living. Over time, the system understands that it needs to adjust to things that are in the Torah, but no longer palatable to people for various reasons. I'm going to talk about that in the sermon this morning, because you have also in the Parsha, the Ben Sorera Moreh, right? The rebellious son. I'm going to talk about that in the sermon this morning a little bit. What do you do when you find material in the Torah that you say, that you can't do that? And the system has figured out a way to, when that material comes up, to take care of it, to make it work. Maybe is a good way to say it, to make it work.
The best lesson I've learned from this class, Rabbi Schwartz, is that the Torah is not meant to be read. It's meant to be studied.
Okay.
And that to me makes all the difference.
That's nice, David. You remind me of the great line from the Robert Frost poem, right? The two paths, right? And the one, and that made all the difference. Merle, were you going to say something?
Thank you. I'm just tagging on to what David said. I had read something in a Rabbi Jonathan Sachs commentary, may he rest in peace, that unlike the laws of other religions, entities, our laws are based on history. And, that really spoke very much to me. And he was saying that in many cases, our laws are tikkun, because our laws give us the chance of do-overs, and do-overs based on our shared history. So he was talking about, like, we won't get into this Parsha, but Manasseh and Ephraim, I always used to wonder, why are they 2 of the 12 tribes? Well, that was because of what happened with Reuven and his father, and he defiled the bed. And then, then Yaakov gave the 2 sons of Yosef equal amounts, and they became tribes. So I think it's not enough to study the laws without studying them in situ. And it's beautiful that we have rabbinic tradition in which things do evolve with a nod towards history, but an acknowledgement of the present condition.
So Merle, you just beautifully articulated the primary principle that was behind the creation of conservative movement, which was Wissenschaft des Judentums, right? This sort of scientific study of Jewish life. And largely what that meant was that you have to study texts in historical context. Texts have to be studied in historical context. Okay, folks, I'm going to run. I got to get ready for the bat mitzvah this morning. Hope you have a great Shabbos. We'll see.
Same to you.